All right, for those of you taking notes, especially in the what, why, and how format, I wanted to just briefly review everything that we've gone over. There was a lot today. First of all, we talked a little bit about the definition of trust, and that trust, as opposed to symbiosis, is comfortable with both togetherness and exploration, as opposed to symbiosis, which just wants togetherness and is threatened by exploration. In other words, people who trust are comfortable with and not craving intimacy. They're also comfortable with and not fearful of the autonomy of the other person. Instead, they tend to trust in the other person's loyalty when that person is absent, as opposed to those in the symbiosis mode of relationship who tend to want to control the other partner by keeping them close. In other words, those who trust tend to be comfortable with and see differences as being positive. In other words, complementary, and as qualities that can be seen as sources of growth as opposed to threats to the relationship. Why would we want attachment security or trust? Well, it turns out for a variety of reasons. One is how we attach and the kind of behaviors that our attachment figures approve of tend to make those kind of behaviors feel good or right in our adulthood. We related this in the lecture to Roger's notion of conditions of worth. And it turns out that we can even prime attachment in people who are insecurely attached. So when you prime attachment, you can do this by, well, we'll go over how to do that, but you prime it by making them think about or recall attachment figures. And by priming this attachment, you can actually get people to be more cognitively open to others. You can lower their feelings of threat that tend to be induced by outgroups. You can tend to also then, in turn, lower the level of feelings of hostility that people feel towards those in outgroups. You can, when looking at people who are different than ourselves, especially with respect to worldview or religious beliefs, priming attachment tends to lower their critical opinions of other people's worldviews. All of these kind of go together with this lower feeling of threat and hostility by the outgroup. It turns out when you prime attachment, you also tend to see an increased level of endorsement of what Shalom Schwartz calls self-transcendent values. Those are the values of benevolence, trying to do kind things unto people who are close to you within your in-group, and the values of benevolence, trying to promote equality for all or doing kind things, promoting good things for people even outside the in-group. You tend to also see increased levels of altruism, including people willing to take the place of someone else who's suffering in experimental conditions. Turns out that on the whole, secure attachment, being securely attached, tends to reduce the frequency with which people negatively misinterpret relational noise, which we talked about in a previous lecture. In other words, I'm less likely, when you respond to me in a neutral or even positive way, when I'm securely attached, I'm more likely to see that as positive and less likely to see that, misinterpret that as being negative, and so get into the tit versus tat echo chamber that we talked about in a previous lecture. We also tend to transmit our attachment styles to our children. So if we don't work to earn a different attachment style in adulthood, it's likely that our children will end up with a similar attachment style to our own. Now, one of the neurobiological benefits of secure attachment is that those who are securely attached tend to show a greater level of resilience for negative emotions and tend to show a greater capacity to regulate positive and negative emotions when they arise. In contrast, anxious or avoidantly attached individuals tend to show a few different behavioral qualities in their relationships. They tend to be less sensitive to their partner's needs. They tend to report less cooperative caregiving. They tend to offer their partners less comfort and reassurance, especially when they're distressed. They tend to be less likely to respond to partners' suffering out of a concern for their needs, and instead they tend to respond out of a more egoistic desire to just sort of reduce their own anxiety in the moment. And in turn with this, they're more likely to experience distress at another's distress. Note, these last two are links with empathy, or the empathy is kind of shadow virtue of distress at another's distress. It turns out that secure attachments also tend to predict how we feel about God or a deity. When I'm securely attached, I'm more likely to have a more loving or forgiving, grace-filled God image. Now remember, a God image is different from a God concept. Our God image is our more affective or elephant-like feelings about God. And it turns out that secure attachment is less, or in some studies, not at all related to our God concept. In other words, we can believe certain things about God theologically, but not feel them at the gut level of our God image. And finally, it turns out trust is helpful because we actually need trustworthy others to help us continue to regulate our affect and emotions as adults. Okay, so all this is good, but how do we go about developing attachment and trust? Well, we talked a little bit about how partners can develop trust within a relationship, and that is through the acronym of ATTUNE. One is showing a sense of awareness of your partner's emotion. Once you detect that emotion, partners who promote trust are more likely to turn towards the emotion as opposed to turning away from it. They can do this in part because they're able to tolerate having two different viewpoints at the same time, and they try to make an effort to understand their partners as opposed to contradict their partner's responses. In other words, they show a non-defensive response to their partner's differences. One of the ways to denigrate trust is by what's referred to as Control-Alt, CLALT, which stands for Comparison Level for Alternatives. In other words, the more I tend to think about how could I be doing better in this relationship, the less trust I'm likely to promote. How do we promote attachment? Well, in part by trying to prime that neo-mammalian brain, or what Darshan Narvez refers to as the seat of our ethic of engagement, and to try to quiet the reptilian brain. So any of the exercises we've talked about before that tend to quiet that fight, flight, seeking reptilian brain are likely to increase our chance of promoting and feeling trust. We can, ideally as parents or as caregivers, provide a sense of consistent, emotionally attuned caregiving. This is what we've talked about in previous classes with respect to attachment relationships. And this is especially relevant in the first couple of years of life, as you will have learned in Dr. Wu's child and adolescent development. Otherwise, it turns out that our brains are more likely to become wired to search for safety and to expect other people to be threatening or dangerous or likely to leave. In other words, inconsistent caregiving tends to prime that reptilian brain. We reviewed a little bit about 4 different attachment styles and talked about those as differing across 2 different dimensions. One way to think about those dimensions is how you view the self and the other. The other way to view those dimensions is neurobiologically, which parts of the reptilian brain tend to get primed. So in secure attachment, you tend to show a positive view of the self. In other words, and neurobiologically, you're less likely to have your fear-flight part of the reptilian brain primed. You also tend to show a positive view of the other, and in the reptilian brain, you have a low level of activation in that numbing and distancing part of the reptilian brain. Preoccupied or anxiously attached individuals tend to have a negative view of themselves, tend to have a high fear-flight priming in the brain, while still maintaining a positive view of the other or a low numbing or distancing. Fearfully attached individuals tend to have both a negative view of themselves and a negative view of the other, and they tend to show higher levels of priming in both the fear-flight parts of their reptilian brain and in the numbing and distancing. Dismissing individuals tend to show a negative view of themselves, but that should be a positive view of themselves, but a negative view of the other. In other words, let me correct that briefly. So those individuals show a positive view of themselves and low in the fear flight, but but a negative view of the other, and higher in the numbing and distancing. Finally, one of the ways you can go about getting some of the same kind of results of baseline attachment security is actually to prime people's attachment security. And you can do this essentially by getting their minds to remember attachment figures. You can do this even by subliminally presenting the names of secure attachment figures. At a greater level of intensity, you can ask participants to visualize the faces of those secure others. And at a higher level of intensity, you can get people to remember and even savor safe and loving interaction that they've had with their security figures. Ultimately, the final thing that we did in this lecture was to do an exercise in which we primed and promoted security within a platonic relationship within the class, which is to try to promote trust. In other words, express ways of appreciating the other person that make them feel more trustworthy. When that happens, to try to savor them as they come along, and then ultimately, in the end, to be able to express gratitude. And those are some of the exercises we did in class.